Welcome to our PhD webinar on introductions. And in this webinar, we're going to be looking at how we can take the horror out of preparing to write an introduction by breaking it down, figuring out what should be contained, and some different techniques and ideas to help get you started. Now, when we sit down to write, you've probably heard this idea that an introduction should actually end up being the piece of writing that you start last. And many people will say that you should actually begin with your methods and your results. Now, there is some wisdom in starting to write the methods and results, typically because these tend to be things you have already completed. However, I think that there's a major problem in avoiding writing your introduction as the first thing. Introductions help to provide a clear focus, and without a clear focus, you may end up actually needing to revise your methods, your results, and your discussion much more because you didn't clearly indicate the amount of information, the type of information that would actually be relevant to contain in your article in the first place. So, what are some of the reasons why we should actually start to write an introduction? Well, if we think about it this way, as an introduction is the first thing that you should write before you sit down to write any other section of a scientific article, it's because it really helps to provide focus on what should be contained in all of the other sections of the article. And this is where I think a lot of people get it confused. An introduction really should then be the last part of your article that you revise. And that's to make sure that your introduction is actually reflecting all of the information that you have written down in your methods, your results, your discussion, and your conclusion. And we want to make sure that where we start in our introduction is reflective of where we end in our conclusion. This is where I think a lot of people get the idea that the introduction is actually the last thing you should write. No, I think it's the first thing that you should write to provide that focus, but it is the last part of the paper that you're going to revise. And good introductions are as long or short as they need to be because they need to move through these three very specific stages of developing context and necessary background information for your reader. They introduce how you frame your topic, be it a problem, a puzzle, or a gap. And then you move down towards something much more specific, your contribution, the hypothesis or thesis statement. And while that seems very easy, realistically, introductions are really difficult to start writing because there's a lot of different puzzling pieces that we need to try to fit together and find a solution to. And I think a lot of people struggle with their introductions because they take some very simple things for granted. So if we really look at how we can simplify the process of writing an introduction, it will help us to get started writing our introduction first and providing us with focus for what should be contained in all of the other sections that follow. And an easy way to do that is recognize that there are 4 questions that an introduction must answer. And they're really quite straightforward. We need to answer who is this article for? Who's our audience? We need to identify what the article is really about. We need to identify why the article is important and the research that we have done is justified, as well as how are we going to demonstrate our research in writing and demonstrate our conclusions. And basically, when we think about it, starting out with question 1 is really about addressing the most general information we need to find an answer to, and as we move through each of these questions, we become more and more specific in the information that we need to provide in our introduction. And very often I hear, how long should an introduction be? Well, there is no magical number to that. Realistically, an introduction is as long or as short as it needs to be. And depending on the length and the need of how long it should be, comes down to the type of audience that you have. If you're predominantly writing for the specialists within your field, you can assume that they probably understand a lot of the background context, and it's easier for you to get into the more technical and specific aspects of your research much more quickly, making your introduction much shorter. However, if you're writing for the generalists, you probably need to provide a much more extensive background to really introduce your research before you can get into the more technical and specific aspects of it. That's ultimately a question that you need to answer for yourself, and a good way to determine that is also look at the types of articles that you have been reading in the journals that you're interested in publishing for. They will give you a good idea of how long an introduction can be expected to be. Question number 2 comes down to what is your research really about? And this is about providing then additional context, the background that your audience can connect with. So understanding who your audience is directly influences what needs to be presented and in what order in order to develop that context and understanding. As part of this, we also need to figure out not just the background information that's necessary to provide, but how is it that we're going to introduce our specific topic based off of that general information? How are we going to frame the issue that we're actually researching in order to establish context for the reader to understand why our research is important? The third question comes down to justifying the need for our research. Demonstrating that there are issues or challenges within the current field helps us to justify the need for our research and why our readers should read it. And creating this need is really as simple as determining whether or not a problem exists. And if so, that should be identified in the introduction because it leads the reader towards the expectation that by the conclusion, there will be a solution proposed. Perhaps there's puzzling information. We don't have a fully clear picture yet, which justifies the need for your research because you're going to try to lead the reader towards a clearer picture and a better understanding. And of course, there might just simply be a knowledge gap that exists, in which case we've justified the need for our research because we're going to attempt to fill that gap. By creating these sorts of justifications, it gives the reader a reason to read our research and enables us to talk about how we can provide a contribution. Our contribution will often require a slight overview of some methodology or theory, but we can very easily go and connect these contributions and give an idea of how our research is going to unfold for the reader by presenting a hypothesis or a thesis statement. Now, very simply put, a hypothesis follows the deductive approach where, through the introduction, we need to present the necessary theory that develops a hypothesis, leading into observations through our methods and our results, coming towards a confirmation or rejection of our hypothesis and or the prevailing theory. Now, the inductive approach, more common in the social sciences, starts from observations first that lead towards patterns, allowing tentative hypotheses to evolve, whereby we present a theory by the end. Realistically, what we're aiming to accomplish is establish what our research claim is in 1 to 2 sentences. And there are a few differences between the natural sciences and the social sciences. A hypothesis, most common in the natural sciences, is a question in the form of a statement that guides research inquiry and is used to test relationship between variables. It's often based on previous knowledge and logical assumptions. Our answer will arise through experiments, observations, or analysis of statistical trends, and these hypotheses are strengthened through repeated tests. A thesis statement, on the other hand, is a claim or a statement based on analysis of facts from the research that's already been done. They're useful to make a claim about a situation. They demonstrate through the use of evidence how we as authors came to form that claim. Our answer really arises through analysis that will be presented in the body of the research, and our claim is strengthened by using other researchers' findings. So let's look into this in a little bit more detail, because a hypothesis requires us to really think more like a detective. And if we apply some of these big questions, well, a hypothesis, what does it do? It makes a prediction. Why does it make a prediction? To test a theory or relationships between variables. And how is it that we can do that? Well, we do it so that the hypothesis can be proven or disproven through experiments. And a hypothesis, a strong hypothesis in 1 to 2 sentences can look something like this, where we see that there is a clear research question in the form of a statement. We can see what the variables will be. We can see the predicted effects. And then we can expect as we read through the article whether or not the hypothesis is proven or disproven. We can also look in to see what the topic is, relationships between oxygen concentrations and lice infestation in trout. We can see what the framing is. There's perhaps a problem in lice infestations with trout, or perhaps there is a gap in knowledge. We don't understand this relationship between oxygen concentrations and lice infestations. So in this way, the reader, through the hypothesis, is getting almost all of these what, why, and how questions explained to them. However, if we take a thesis statement, it's much more in the line of thinking like a lawyer. And why do we have thesis statements? Well, they make a claim. Why do we make a claim? To defend a position. And how do we defend that position? By developing, supporting, and explaining the argument or the position we have taken throughout the article. This, of course, is much more common in the social sciences, whereby what we present first is explained later, almost like we present our answer before the question. So let's look at how a thesis statement could be developed strongly in 1 to 2 sentences. In the sentence presented here, we can see a clear claim. That claim supports a stance, and that stance indicates that there is a problem. Persistent hunger. We also end up seeing the causes for that: infertile soils and employment scarcity. How this position was formed is then expected to be explained throughout the rest of the article. A hypothesis or a thesis statement will ultimately depend on your own research background and what it is that you are trying to accomplish for the journal that you're writing for. Now, just a quick note on the idea of meta-discourse. Meta-discourse happens a lot in introductions, and essentially, meta-discourse is this idea of writing about writing, or as visualized here, thinking about thinking. Introductions tend to be full of meta-discourse because there's this expectation that we need to explain the structure of every section that's going to be contained within our article. And generally, it'll look something like this. After we have a hypothesis or a thesis statement, something nice and strong and concrete and very specific about what the article will be about, we get information like, this article will first present the methods used to test the hypothesis. Afterwards, relevant results will be shown and discussed separately in the discussion. The reason why this is less helpful than you think is that unless if there is a formal requirement by the journal to include this type of meta-discourse, it's sort of a, yeah, obviously moment. The readers are expecting you to present methods, results, discussion, and a conclusion. They don't need you to tell them what each section is responsible to do or how the paper is laid out. That is the role of your headings and your subheadings. The best thing you can do is avoid meta-discourse and use the words that you would have used to inform the reader about the structure of your article, to explain and provide more supporting details to answer the 4 big questions for your research. If you would like to learn more about how you can structure, we have a PhD webinar video available through our YouTube channel. To summarize, every introduction that you read and every introduction that you write is going to move from general to specific in an attempt to answer these 4 questions. If you can answer them, either in a full paragraph, in several paragraphs, or even as bullet points before you sit down to start writing your methods, your results, and your discussion sections, you'll have a much better focus for what should be included in those subsequent sections in your writing.